It seemed clear to detectives investigating the brutal murder and robbery of the wealthy company director's wife that the killer must have had some knowledge of the house and location. They quickly deduced he or she was probably a current or former employee, and it was a case of eliminating all the innocent parties until they were left with the likely suspect. 60-year-old Frederick Cuthbert Wiltshaw was the managing director of Wiltshaw and Robinson Carlton Ware pottery firm in Stoke-on-Trent with offices in London. It was a very successful business that afforded the family the luxury of an imposing 14-room villa, Estoril, on Station Road, Barlaston, near Stone, Staffordshire in the English Midlands. Wiltshaw lived at the house with his 62-year-old wife Alice and Midge, her pet toy poodle, since their 4 daughters had, one by one, married and left home. With her husband at work, Alice was assisted in the day-to-day running of the house by 2 maids, Ada Barlow and Florence Durrell, and Roy Shenton, a handyman, gardener and chauffeur. The maids would finish for the day around 4 p.m, and Alice would then pour herself a drink and begin to prepare her husband's tea. On Wednesday evening, the 16th of July 1952, Frederick Wiltshaw finished work for the day at around 4 p.m, and as he often did, he stopped off at Trentham Golf Club for a game of bridge. Arriving home shortly after 6:15, he parked his Rover car in the garage and entered the house through the back kitchen door. At once, Wiltshaw could tell something was amiss. Lying on the kitchen floor in a pool of water and raw vegetables was a saucepan with a broken handle. Moving into the adjacent hallway, he recoiled at the dreadful sight that greeted him. His wife lay in a pool of blood. Her head showed signs of a fearful beating, and her upper body and arms were a mass of cut and bruises. Beside the body were 2 large wooden logs from the fire, the remains of a broken vase, and a heavy brass poker. Wiltshaw picked up his telephone and summoned a neighbour, Dr. Harold Brown, who lived next door but one. Brown needed only a cursory glance to see that Alice Wiltshaw was dead, and immediately called the police. First to the scene was Detective Constable Alf Robbins, and seeing that this was clearly a murder scene, contacted his superiors, who hurried to the house. As they waited for one officer to arrive, Brown led Wiltshaw away from the distressing scene and into the garden. They walked along the garden path that led towards a gate at the rear of the premises, and Brown noticed a pair of cream leather gloves close to some bushes. Wiltshaw also mentioned that it was unusual for the gate to be left open. A police dog and its handler from Birmingham were rushed to the scene, but were unable to pick up a trail beyond the open gate. But this did suggest it was the killer's exit route. Superintendent Tom Lockley, head of Staffordshire Police, after examining the scene and speaking to the victim's husband, wasted no time in asking for the assistance of Scotland Yard. It had long been the rule that Scotland Yard detectives offered their services free of charge. They were called in at the start of the investigation. Lockley realised at once that this was going to be a tricky case to crack and wasted no time in picking up the telephone. Detective Superintendent Reginald Spooner and his Sergeant Ernie Millen were immediately detailed to investigate and hurried to Euston Station to take a train north. On the following morning, the Scotland Yard detectives were present when Home Office pathologist James Webster carried out the post-mortem. He found that the cause of death was shock and hemorrhaging due to the horrific head injuries almost certainly caused by the poker found beside the body. Her skull was smashed in, her nose flattened and both jaws shattered. She had also been stabbed so many times with the poker that almost all the blood in the body had drained away with all the numerous cuts and gashes. Webster later recorded that of all the cases he was involved with, this was by far the most vicious attack he had seen. The detectives needed to eliminate the obvious suspects, inasmuch as they were the last people to see the victim alive. The 2 maids had left the house at 3:30, and handyman Shenton had left on his motorbike at 5:25. Shenton said that Mrs. Wiltshaw was cooking in the kitchen when he went to say goodbye. They were all quickly found to be in the clear, and Fred Wiltshaw was also able to satisfy the detectives of his innocence. The initial line of inquiry found that 2 teenagers had been seen on Station Road that afternoon. Neighbours mentioned seeing a young man and woman acting suspiciously earlier in the afternoon, but this came to nothing and the focus shifted elsewhere. It soon became clear that the motive was robbery. A purple leather case containing over £3,000 worth of jewellery, including rings, a brooch, wallet, cigarette case and a purse had been taken from the house. The killer had also wrenched 2 rings from the dead woman's fingers, a baguette ring and an eternity ring. Asked if anything else had been taken, Wiltshaw said that his old RAF greatcoat that hung in the kitchen seemed to be missing. The detectives reasoned that the killer must have taken the coat to cover his clothes, which, due to the horrific nature of the injuries, would most likely be covered in blood. Also discovered at the scene were a number of distinctive patterned footprints on the kitchen floor. Spooner had the area dug up and taken to a local laboratory for further investigation. Detectives began a check on past employees at the house and over the next few days began to eliminate them all from their inquiries, with one exception: former chauffeur cum gardener Leslie Terrence Terry Green. Born in Middleton, Leeds, Green had worked for the Wiltshaws since October 1950 but had been dismissed on the 6th of May that year after he had taken Wiltshaw's car without permission. Detectives found that Green had a string of previous convictions for theft which he had failed to disclose to the Wiltshaws. A visit to all Green's known haunts failed to locate the missing chauffeur, and inquiries at his last known address on Castle Street, Sandford Hill, Stoke, drew a blank. His estranged wife and mother of his 6-year-old daughter told them she hadn't seen him for a while but knew he had been short of money. As the hunt for Green was taking place, the Scotland Yard detectives went over the evidence so far. Millen focused on the raincoat. It seemed likely that the killer had taken it to cover his own clothes and would have had to dispose of it somewhere after leaving the murder scene. He reasoned the killer would have certainly rid himself of the coat, as being found in possession of it would have been enough to hang him. At the bottom of the Wiltshaws' garden was a path that led towards the railway station at Barlaston, and with the gate left open, detectives reasoned that the killer would have chosen to escape this way. This again supported the notion that the killer had local knowledge. Believing that the overcoat was important to the investigation, Miller liaised with the officers for British Transport Police, who agreed to search for the missing coat. It was located a few days later at the left luggage office at Holyhead Station, Anglesey, having been left aboard a Stafford to Holyhead express train. Detectives began to build up a picture of their wanted man, and found that although married, he had a girlfriend, an Irish-born nurse, Nora Lammy, who worked at a hospital in his native Leeds. It had been to Leeds where Green had driven when he had taken Wiltshaw's car without permission. A week after the murder, on Wednesday the 23rd of July, the funeral of Alice Wiltshaw took place at Barlaston Parish Church. Workers at Wiltshaw's pottery firm, friends and neighbours and members of the police formed a congregation of over 200 as the cortege moved to the Carmount Side crematorium for the cremation. Later that afternoon, after the funeral service ended, Spooner, convinced they had their man, decided to release Green's name to the press as someone they wished to trace to help them with their inquiries. Seeing Green's name mentioned in the newspapers, Nora Lammy's sister in Belfast wrote asking if Leslie Green was in fact her boyfriend Terry Green. She confronted him and he said it was him, and the police wanted to speak to him as he was a former employee. Later that day, he also confessed that although separated from his wife, he was still married and not the wealthy man she had been led to believe he was. Green said he would try to get it sorted out, but on Wednesday afternoon he walked calmly to Longton Police Station, Stoke-on-Trent, and told the desk sergeant, "I'm Leslie Green, I believe you want to see me." Green gave a detailed account of his movements on the day of the murder. He said he had travelled up from London that day, intending to visit his wife and obtain a separation order. On the way up, he stopped at the Station Hotel in Stafford, where he stayed drinking with 4 men in the bar. They then decided to take lunch there and went into the dining room. At 4:30 after the meal, they returned to the bar, where after more drinks they stayed until about 5 o'clock. Green said he felt he had drank too much Guinness and went across the road to a park where he fell asleep on a bench. He said he then went to the railway station to collect his bag from the left luggage office and returned to the station hotel at 5:45. Then, after wash and freshen up, he had tea in the hotel dining room and caught a train from Stafford to Leeds that departed a few minutes after 7. Green had a room booked at the Leeds Metropole Hotel, and he said he arrived in the city around midnight. After checking in, he made his way across Leeds to see Nora Lammy. Nora worked at the Claremont nursing home, but when he arrived he found she had already gone to bed. Green said he had coffee with some of the nurses on duty and then went back to his hotel. Spooner set to work checking out the alibi. Whilst it was true he had been in the hotel, the manager challenged the times Green had offered to the detectives. He said that the meal was served at 3:30, not 4:30, and it was more like 6:30 than 5:45 that Green returned to the hotel. These timings were crucial. Spooner worked out that Green could have caught the 5:05 train from Stafford to Barlaston. He knew that all the staff would have left for the day and Mrs. Wiltshaw would have been alone in the house at that time. The train reached Barlaston at 5:40. Green knew the path that allowed him to reach the house without being seen. He would then have 15 minutes to commit murder and robbery before heading back to Barlaston station and catch the return train to Stafford to cement his alibi. Detectives went to his wife's house and made a search of Green's bedroom. They found a number of dress shirts and other items he had stolen from the Wiltshaws whilst in their employment, and he was charged with theft and remanded in custody pending further investigation. Looking into the relationship between Green and Nora Lammy, they found the couple had got together while he was still employed as a chauffeur with the Wiltshaws. He was dismissed after taking their Rover car without permission to see Nora at work in Leeds, and following his dismissal, he worked as a labourer for a couple of weeks. Nora was a native of Moneymore, County Londonderry, and twice in June and July that summer, Green flew to the province to see her. While there, he proposed, she accepted, and they visited a local church where the banns were read on a provisional date of Saturday, August the 9th, set for the wedding. At this time, she believed Green was a wealthy single man who worked as a traveller in the pottery business. With Green now the prime suspect and held on remand for the theft of items from the Wiltshaws, Spooner and his team needed to prove that he had carried out the murder and could break his alibi. A check on all tickets issued and submitted on the day of the murder in the Staffordshire area revealed that a ticket issued at Barlaston had been surrendered at Leeds that night. This seemed to prove Green was lying when he claimed not to have been in Barlaston on that day. From speaking to Nurse Lammy, they heard that on the day of the murder, he had checked out to the Metropole Hotel and they had moved into a friend's flat for a few days. Green had then presented her with 2 rings, but when she heard from her sister about the murder, she returned the rings to him. Questioned about the rings, Green said he had got them off 2 men, Lorenzo and Charlie, in Leeds. He said he had first met them at the Cameo Ballroom on Market Street, Longton, a few months earlier. Green admitted that he suspected these 2 men were involved in the murder at Barlaston, and as a result had thrown items they had given him, a gold cigarette case and 2 rings, into the River Aire at Leeds. Spooner failed to find any Lorenzo and Charlie, and divers in the river failed to find any of the missing property. The detectives got the vital breakthrough they needed when they spoke to the nurses at the Claremont, where Green had headed for on the night of the murder. Nurse Greta Davis, who had been on duty that night, said Green had shown her rings he said he had bought his fiancée. Spooner had the foresight to have copies of the dead woman's rings made up, and when he showed her these, she identified them as the same ones Green had shown to her a few days before. This proved that Green had the rings in his possession at least 12 hours before he said he'd received them from the 2 men. Convinced that he had stashed the rings rather than throw them away, detectives travelled back to the flat in Leeds where Green had been staying and methodically searched every inch of the premises. It paid off. Hidden in the coal cellar, beneath a loose brick several feet off the ground, were the 2 missing rings. They were the only items stolen from the house to be recovered. And with this find, Green was now charged with murder. Leslie Terrence Green's trial before Mr Justice Stable at Staffordshire Assizes began on Monday the 1st of December. From the outset, Mr Justice Stable told the jury that they were trying a horrific murder, and he deemed that the police photographs taken at the scene of the crime were too distressing for the jury to see. Edward Ryder Richardson QC led for the prosecution and told the jury that the evidence against Green, although circumstantial, was decisive. The gloves found in Wiltshire's back garden had a tear in the thumb on the left hand. This matched perfectly with the newly healed scar on Green's hand, and blood found on the inside of the RAF coat matched the wound on Green's upper arm. The distinctive marks on the kitchen floor were made by an unusual patterned shoe, identical to a pair of espadrilles Green had purchased on a recent holiday to Spain. But it was the rings that would ultimately lead to Green's conviction. His story that he'd been given them by two friends on the Thursday was effectively shattered when Nurse Davies swore she had seen them in Green's possession on the same night of the murder and hours before Green admitted having them in his possession. On the third day of the trial, Sergeant Miller prepared to enter the dock. Green whispered to his guards, "If Ernie Miller gives evidence that hangs me, I'll come back to haunt him." "He'd better get in the queue," Spurner was heard to say when told of Green's comments. On the fifth and final day of the trial, with the evidence completed, the jury of 10 men and 2 women needed less than half an hour to find Leslie Green guilty of murder. There was no appeal, so it was simply a case of setting a date for the execution on the first day of the week, but not a Monday, after 3 Sundays had elapsed. Thus, at 8 o'clock on Tuesday the 23rd of December, Leslie Terrence Green was hanged at Winson Green Prison, Birmingham. Chief executioner was Albert Pierpoint, participating in his 21st execution of 1952, one of the busiest years for hangings since the turn of the century. For Assistant Sid Durnley, this was to be his last engagement. There is no truth in the story he was dismissed for making a crude remark at a previous execution a week earlier. The simple fact is he had an unfortunate run of reprieves throughout 1953 until he was arrested for running an illegal mail-order boot club and struck off the list when he was sent to prison for 6 months in 1954. The Scotland Yard detectives and local officers involved in solving the crime were praised by the judge, who said it was a perfect example of police investigation. Every stage of Green's attempted alibi was destroyed, with detectives finding evidence that contradicted his story. Following Green's conviction, his former fiancée refused to see him in jail. She had quit her job at the hospital in readiness for their wedding and told reporters that she would take a holiday in Paris before returning and trying to get her life back on track. It is believed she moved to London and married in 1954. Frederick Wiltshaw died in Cheshire in 1966 at the age of 74. The villa where Alice Wiltshaw was brutally battered to death later became the Westwood Memorial College. It closed in 2012 and has been derelict since. In 1993, police were informed that a man was claiming that Green was innocent and they knew the identity of the real killers. Was this the mysterious Lorenzo and Charlie? Officers looked into the case but quickly dismissed the new claims, satisfied with the outcome of the trial, and that when Green dropped through the trapdoors at Birmingham jail, justice was done and Alice Wiltshaw was avenged. My name is Steve Fielding. Thank you for watching and listening to another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. If you have enjoyed the video, please click like, and if you don't already, then ask you please to subscribe to the channel. There is no charge, it just keeps you up to date with new content as it is posted. Please check out my website, stevefielding.com, where you can find information on all my books and order copies of the 3-volume Hangman's Record series at a special discount price. My latest book, Tales from the Hangman's Record Volume 1, is now available from Amazon as a paperback and Kindle download. Also check out my podcast channels, Tales from the Hangman's Record and Mostly Murder. Do you think the verdict in this case was correct? Please use the comments below for your thoughts on the case and for suggestions for further episodes in the Tales from the Hangman's Record series.